Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessikah with Turn the Page podcast, Syosset Public Library, and my guest today is...
Hello, I am Natalie Zina Walschots. I am the author of Hench, and I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We are thrilled to have you, and your book is one of those books that when I was scrolling through different ARCs on NetGalley, which is how a lot of us librarians get our reads before they come out now. We used to get more physical copies, but since COVID, it's been all NetGalley all the time.
Right, yeah, that of course, that makes sense.
It's your book, Hench. As soon as it came up, it was one of those books that I immediately took to as inject this book into my veins right now, because it was clearly written for me. I and several of my coworkers are big sci-fi fans, and I have always been a fan of anything that sort of goes behind the scenes of villains and heroes. So like Venture Brothers.
Oh yeah, huge Venture Brothers fan. Absolutely.
Yep, and my boys are actually fraternal twin boys, which is, so we have to teach them Go Team Venture.
Spectacular.
And The Tick, and now last year The Boys came out. I've always really, really liked just the idea of what goes on behind the scenes with heroes and villains. And you, with Hench, bring a completely different twist to it that is so refreshing and also gives you what you want if that's what you like to begin with. I think it's going to find multiple audiences. So I'm going to stop talking and let you tell us what the book is about.
Sure thing. Well, first of all, that's listening to you shower praise upon me is one of the lovelier things that's happened to me recently. So thank you so much. I'm genuinely thrilled that you liked it, and honestly that anybody has liked it is just like makes my shriveled little apple core of a heart like explode on a daily basis. It's really, really wonderful. So Hench is about a henchwoman. It focuses on Anna, who is, like a lot of people, just trying to get by in this trash gig economy in which so many of us find ourselves, but lives in a universe in which heroes and villains exist, and supervillains need somebody to answer the phones and fill out spreadsheets too. So it begins with her kind of taking on a series of increasingly hilarious and awful jobs as a hench person, until her first real significant run-in with a superhero that leaves her badly injured and unable to work and kind of cast aside by her former employers, and gives her time to start reckoning with the idea that, heroes may actually be doing more damage than good, that the cost of heroism may in fact be too much for the communities they're ostensibly there to protect, to bear. She proves this via math, which is very exciting to me anyway. Oh, yeah. And sort of embarks upon the second half of her career as a much more with a much more focus and sort of with the goal of attempting to balance those scales a little bit and prevent some of the damage that she sees heroes doing to the world. So it sort of is about her career and her ascent and her journey through increasingly morally gray territory and wrestling with a series of increasingly complicated trolley problems, really. And I feel like I've made the book sound very dour.
It's not.
It's
hilarious. It is, and I sold it to one of my coworkers by saying, and it has a Farscape reference, to which
it does have a Farscape.
Extremely excited about.
So Farscape is one of my favorite pieces of media that has ever been created full stop. And because it is weird and the stories are complicated and it is hilarious, and it's also about relationships, right? Like, as much as it's this sort of like space epic, with like huge players and like, warring aliens, it's really about like friendships and relationships and romantic entanglements and romantic unentanglements, and those connections are the core of that show. It has some of the best friendships I've ever seen in television, and that had a deep impact on me, and that's also something that I've tried to put at the core of my work, is that this is really a book about relationships between friends and lovers and colleagues and enemies, like hardcore nemesis to some extent as well. Those are in fact some of the deepest connections in the book, and like I put that reference there as a like particularly precise love letter to that relationship focused kind of sci-fi.
It was great, and it wasn't even like in the beginning of the book. It was at a point where I already adored the book, and it just made me adore it even more. So let's talk about it. It was funny and also angry at the same time, and it was a great combination because Anna had a lot to be angry about. So her first, she's hired as a temp. She and her friend, I believe June,
yes,
are temping for hench people, and they're being hired to do, as you said, like clerical work for supervillains. And Anna gets hired for Electric Eel, who wants everyone to call him E and talk about their feelings, which was great.
E is modeled on, I joke a little bit that like Hench is in fact an autobiography, but E is definitely a bit of a send-off to a series of bosses that I have had who are like really into creating like a friendly like corporate culture and being seen as like these incredibly cool progressive employers who are utter jerks like underneath, who just have like no actual moral center. He's one of my favorite characters. He's just terrible and I love him.
He's awful. He's just awful.
He's awful, man.
So while working for E, Anna gets to do field work. And there's another thing you mentioned, and I believe this is the first time I've ever encountered this term. There's also meat.
Yes.
That works for the villains, and the meat are the people who get beaten up, I believe.
Yeah, it's like, so when I first started thinking about Hench, like this is a book I am going to write, the meat were kind of the thing that came to me first as a lifelong fan of science fiction and superhero stories in particular. I've been reading comics since I was a little kid. I was always like fascinated by hench people and like also horrified by the way that they're treated, which is like you have these ordinary people, right, with ordinary human skill sets and strength and durability, whose job it is to fight superheroes, and they just get, their job is essentially to serve as like the appetizer to the actual battle between the like supervillain and superhero. They're constantly getting horrifically injured and thrown through walls, and it's just supposed to be like exciting and fun and funny. But the second you start thinking about it for a minute, it gets really horrifying. Like as soon as you see them as people instead of pieces of meat to just be thrown around and treated as essentially disposable. Superhero stories and movies stop being quite as fun. So I kind of ruined it for myself in a lot of ways, but in having that kind of like, hey, if I start thinking about all these characters as fully human, all superhero stories suddenly become body horror. I realized that like every hench person's story is so interesting. Like how did you get here? How did you choose to take this job where you're essentially like wearing a hilarious outfit and like laughing at your boss's quips that are somehow like themed around whatever their whole business is, right? Like somebody is just like, their whole job is to like get beaten up instead of, and laugh at the electric eels like ocean jokes, right? Like that is a job. So interesting to me. So the world is populated with people who are again, like physically considered kind of disposable, and whose like primary like currency, I guess, is their like, you know, fighting skill and physical strength, sure, but also their kind of like willingness to put themselves in physical danger for the sake of a supervillain.
I think it's true. And again, going back to some of the things we discussed earlier, I think that's what I liked about a lot of those behind the scenes superhero, supervillain stories. I think back to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, where you had the putties who had like no personality, and they just like were there, and they'd make funny sounds, and the Power Rangers would beat them up, and Rita Repulsa would say something like "ah," and you know, like that. But that would be the main part of the story. But like the putties were literally faceless, and when I'd watch something, for instance, like Batman, the animated series, like the hench people did have more personality, which is how we essentially got Harley Quinn, who has gone through many incarnations and is now a character of her own, whether you consider her gray, heroic, villainous. You know, everybody now just wants to see her kick the Joker to the curb. But it's true. You know, you have these people, they're people, and they have to go with whatever theme the supervillain has. So that was interesting. I liked that. And then, you know, you have like the behind the scenes people. So getting back to the story, so Anna is brought out with E to some showcase where he's going to do something terrible. And Super Collider, who is the Superman, I suppose, or I guess if you've watched The Boys, Homelander would be a pretty good a pretty good analogy. Comes in, and Anna gets her leg like busted, and she's super collided.
She ends up with a spiral fracture, which is a particularly nasty and potentially life-altering injury that is inflicted with absolutely no thought whatsoever. Like Super Collider is not even necessarily like, I don't want to give too much of that confrontation away because I think it's very interesting, but Anna is essentially like a piece of collateral damage, and part of what really impacts her and is both like really devastating and is a source of a lot of the anger that she carries is like she did not matter. Like it was a completely incidental piece of like side damage that caused an injury that has potentially derailed her literal entire life, which you know is a catalyst to, I think, you know, what you pointed out, like a lot of that anger that she carries around is like it's not even necessarily that at that point she was targeted, right? Or like
she was just in the way.
She was just in the room. Yeah, exactly. She was just present. And that kind of like the idea of that of again like disposability and collateral damage like really hits her very, very hard. I think you said something really interesting with the putties. Like, first of all, like A+ Rita Repulsa impression.
Thank you.
But the putties are putties for a reason. In shows like you know, like Power Rangers and like Samurai Jack, where there's a lot of like minions that end up getting like, you know, having the crap kicked out of them and often destroyed. They're deliberately made to be not human, to be less upsetting, right? That like so you don't get to see like actual like physical sentient characters, however you want to think about it. You know, the putties are just like literally made of putty. They're like clay things. They're not like, they're controlled by another person.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have kind of identities or of their own. So when you like, you know, kick them through a building and they like, I don't know, like die or lay down or become inactive or however like putty physiology works. Like we're allowed to not feel bad about that because it's not a person, right? It's not not a sentient person. Yeah, or like the, you know, all the robots in Samurai Jack are robots, right?
However, in the finale that they made, and it was it was definitely for a more mature audience, Jack has to deal with the fact that he's fighting sentient people, and that was 100%. A really interesting way of just delving into his psyche. But we're not here to talk about Samurai Jack. I could do that all day, but we're not going to do that.
Okay. Yes. Refocus. But yes,
refocus.
Exactly, right? Like, and that's that, like, he confronts that challenge, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing that I try and do in a bunch of different ways and from a bunch of different angles in this book, is that, you know, you have, you know, if somebody is classified as a hero and everything they do is therefore heroic, right? And they're kind of protected by both this, you know, like bubble of their own perceived heroism and also a lot of very good marketing. You know, you have people in that position, then like if everything they do is good, then none of the people they hurt matter because they deserve it. And as soon as you start thinking about that in any depth, it really falls apart and gets pretty horrifying.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's so much that could be said in general about that because, you know, people do generally, you can think of, you know, if you think of villains like E as like a corporation, and then like the people, you know, like there's so much collateral damage under that CEO head, and so many people who are faceless and sometimes hurt by the carelessness of I guess, you know, whether or not there's negligence or, but getting back to the Super Collider. So he basically, after that, Anna loses her job with Electric Eel, and she spends a lot of time researching how much damage is done. And this draws a rift between her and her best friend, June, which continues as she gets hired by a wonderfully feared supervillain who is infamous and sees her talents for something more. How did you kind of work into that? Because they were very close in the beginning, and then as soon as, you know, Anna really starts to come into her own with what, you know, I think sort of just grew her character from I'm just going to tempt for this supervillain to growing into those more morally ambiguous ways. Her relationship with June, who also temped with her, just seems to fizzle or fall apart.
It breaks down, you know, both very slow and very fast over a lot of the novel. The relationship between June and Anna is one of the, I think, core relationships in the book. As you said, they're very close to begin with, and the kind of like the devastation of like losing or having a damaged relationship or a ruptured relationship with a very good friend is often extremely upsetting and traumatic in a way that you know, I think doesn't get talked about a lot. Like, we know breakups are bad and suck, but like
friendship breakups
are just as bad or worse. I don't see friendships as secondary relationships, you know, like I feel that and certainly like the relationship between June and Anna is like as deep or deeper than any like romantic relationship represented in the book, for sure, with maybe one exception. And their relationship is damaged a lot by Anna's, the sort of deeper Anna goes down the rabbit hole of like, I can prove superheroes are bad via math, and also starts getting attention for it, like first online via a blog that she creates and the, you know, the data that she starts releasing, or the data that she synthesizes from kind of publicly available stats and starts putting out in the world, that ultimately attracts this villain's attention. because she's recovering, she primarily at June's house. This places June in like a different kind of danger. You know, when June makes the decision to temp and to be somebody who kind of like is working on the like maybe more villainous side of whatever, those are choices she is making, right? She's taking on a particular kind of risk, a particular level of risk, and she has control over it and agency over it. But when Anna starts getting attention, she kind of fails to see how that has its own kind of splash damage. It's like, if you're doing this at my house and getting all of this attention, like you are putting me in physical danger is kind of the, you know, the relationship there, that she doesn't really see how doing what she's doing and becoming what she is becoming in proximity to June places her friend in danger, but her friend does see it, right? June does see it, and June is kind of like intimately aware of risks to herself and to Anna that Anna just is not. Part of that is that you know, Anna also sort of fails to see that June as a Black woman has different things to deal with in the world than she does, and is sort of like has different is placed at risk in different ways and in different situations. So Anna is kind of unable to apply that lens to the situation that she is creating, and ultimately it damages that friendship.
Yeah, it was really real. Everybody has, I think, gone through a friendship where for one reason or another it sort of hits its limits.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many factors as to why, and it is very painful, and it was portrayed very well. You also have some office politics, which is always fun because most of us have worked in some sort of setting, you know, or even if it's not an office, even if you're just going into the staff room of, like, you know, like a restaurant, mm-hmm. There's always something mundane, and you know, like there's the different types of people who work in the office, and that was really well done. I really did enjoy watching Anna develop relationships with the other members of Leviathan, who's her ultimate boss, his team.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked him too. He was a really good character.
Thank you.
He was fabulous.
I'm quite like proud and surprised of how he kind of turned out. That, you know, like there's supervillains are both really easy and really hard to write in a way, because you don't it's very easy to play on cliche, but it's also very hard not to like descend into them. But yeah, he's a very weird person, question mark.
Yes.
And I, you know, having someone who is both kind of incredibly strange and incredibly alien, but is also somebody you can connect with, is like a complicated but ultimately really rewarding challenge. And I'm really pleased with how he turned out.
So is there anything else you would like to just talk about the story? I feel like any further we go is going to give a little too much away as to how things unfold.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I don't want to dig too much into the like specifics of the narrative any further.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just to say that there are it has a lot to say about like abuses of power and institutional power in particular. It has you know, there are other friendships that kind of like ebb and flow and rise and fall in ways throughout the book that are also important. I don't think we've touched upon a few of the key relationships, but certainly not all of them. So I think there's a lot more to explore there. And yeah, maybe just a tiny content warning that like for us, unlike a lot of superhero stories where it's all violence all the time, the violence is relatively rare, but when it's there, it's pretty intense.
That's fair.
So
yeah.
just like maybe like I would say a quick flag for a potential reader there. I really like think body horror is fascinating, and it's a genre I play with a lot. So, but I always want to like flag that just in case, maybe not for someone who would not like to encounter that. So
yeah, fair enough. No, when does this book come out?
It comes out on September 22nd, so very soon now, which is very exciting.
Yes.
And the early response has been extraordinary. Like I'm super blown away by it. I feel like the librarians of the earth really like rallied around this book in a way that was incredibly
There's
like
so many librarians who are just huge nerds, and
you always count on the nerds.
Well, it just speaks to so many of us in the ways that we like. So
I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, so that's been really thrilling. So it has always been my sincerest hope that like people would just read and like the book, and that seems to be happening, and I'm just thrilled about it.
Any chance of a sequel?
I would like that very much. Obviously, like there are a lot of pieces involved in that. It certainly is written in a way where it could be concluded, but there are a lot of doors that are open. And I have definitely been thinking about and making notes toward what a sequel might look like. So I would really dearly like that to happen. So hopefully.
So anybody who's listening, librarian or reader or otherwise fan of superhero stories, make this a complete hit because we want to see more.
Yes,
check it out, buy it for your friends, tell everybody about it.
There's also an audiobook that has been narrated by Alex McKenna that's also going to be fantastic. So I'm very excited about that. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you again. Once again, this is Jessikah, and my guest was
Natalie Zina Walschots. Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
This is great. And I'm going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.